Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our Federal Reserve lesson. Today, we're going to be covering 2 of the 3 tools the Federal Reserve has to control the money supply and therefore control the rate of inflation. What this means is the Federal Reserve controls our nation's monetary policy. So to make sure we understand the Federal Reserve's role, let's just look back at a couple of the important things to know about the Fed really quick. Some things that you guys need to know about the Federal Reserve is that it is the country's central bank. Now, we covered this in our last lesson. We said that it also clears checks and regulates the money supply and transfers between banks, but it's also the central bank of the United States. So, for this reason, it's the lender of last resort. Remember, banks are always giving each other loans all the time. As in, if they're running low on reserves or they're running low on money, they can always go to another bank and ask for help. What the Federal Reserve does is if no bank will lend a major partner bank money, it will loan that bank money. So if Chase Bank is running low on money and no other bank will give it a loan, that bank can always go to the Federal Reserve to get that loan. And we'll cover more about how that works in part 3. Also, the Federal Reserve controls the reserve requirement. Remember, the reserve requirement is the amount of money that a bank has to hold on to and cannot lend out. So what the reserve requirement does, it has 2 important aspects and qualities that affect it on a bank. One, a bank with small reserves is going to be considered to be less stable. Now, it's less stable because it's holding on to less money. So if just a few people go to the bank and say, I'd like to withdraw my money, the bank would run out quickly. On the other hand, that bank is holding on to less money. That means they can loan more out. So that bank would be more profitable and offer people better loans or cheaper interest rates. But remember, on the other hand, it would also be less stable. However, a bank with large reserves is considered to be more stable. It's holding on to a larger pile of money. So if more people go to the bank and say, hey, I want all my money out, the bank can meet more of their request. But on the other hand, that bank would be considered to be less profitable because now it's holding on to more money and loaning smaller amounts out. And because it's loaning less out, they would charge a higher price for those loans, like higher interest rates for customers. So that bank would be less profitable. So those are 2 things. And we also make sure that the Federal Reserve uses M1 and M2 to control the money supply. That's how they measure how much money's in the economy. Remember, M1 is money that is extremely liquid, as in you can spend it right now. And M2 is what we call near money. It's money that you can spend pretty quick, but not immediately. You have to do at least one thing before you can spend it. And the important thing to think of today and what we're covering are these last 2 parts here at the bottom. Remember, if there is an increase in the money supply, this would increase inflation because more people have money, more people spend money, they buy more things, stores run out. So the stores raise their price next time so they don't run out of goods so quickly. And if there's a decrease in the money supply, this would reduce inflation. If people have less money, they buy less things. Well, if stores aren't selling as many things, they lower their prices. And therefore, you could have deflation or less inflation, what we call disinflation. Now, what we're getting at today is we're going right back to that reserve requirement. So remember, the reserve requirement is the money that banks have to hold on to. So if the Fed were to increase the reserve requirement, that means a bank would be required to hold on to more money and not lend it out. So banks would have to hold on to more money and would not be able to lend as much out. Now, if banks are lending less money out, people are getting fewer loans. If people get fewer loans, they're making less purchases. They're spending less money. This would decrease the supply of money. Now, if we decrease the supply of money, this would cause less inflation. Okay, so they would not be able to loan as much out. This would decrease the supply of money, thus decreasing inflation. So a higher reserve requirement means the price level or inflation rate would decrease. Now, on the other hand, and I bet if you understood that, the next part you can do on your own. So think about it. If the Fed were to decrease the reserve requirement, then banks would probably not be able to, or I'm sorry, they would be able to loan more money out. So if they decrease the reserve requirement, banks would be able to hold on to less money. So banks would be able to hold on to less money and would then be able to loan more out. So if they're holding on to less money and loan more out, think about what happens next. People are going to get more loans. And if people get more loans, that means they're using that money to buy more things. So this would, what do you think, increase or decrease the supply of money? The answer is that would increase the supply of money, thus increasing inflation. Okay, so that's simply how the reserve requirement works. Now, the Federal Reserve almost never touches the reserve requirement to control money. And you might say, then why are we even covering it? Well, two important reasons. One, it can do that. However, the reserve requirement also dictates how stable a bank is and how profitable it is. So the Federal Reserve wants banks to be profitable and they want banks to be stable. So they want to find a good balance. And when the Federal Reserve finds a good balance, well, they usually keep the reserve requirement right where it is because they have two other tools to control inflation besides it, which are open market operations and the discount rate, which we'll be getting to soon. However, if you guys are paying attention to the news and Federal Reserve policy like I am, okay, maybe you're just, oh, it's only me. You might find that the Federal Reserve has changed the reserve requirement, and this is something we're going to be focusing on soon. This is very, very rare, and they're taking some very drastic measures right now due to the COVID-19 and kind of the issues surrounding it and how it's affecting the economy. All right, but anyway, we'll be getting to that stuff soon. On the other point we have here is something called open market operations. So open market operations is considerably more complicated than the reserve requirement. So I'm going to show you guys a little diagram here so you can understand more of how it works. So try to follow along. Open market operations is when the Fed buys or sells bonds. So what you might be asking is, what is a bond? Well, a bond is essentially an IOU. What it means is typically we're going to be talking about Treasury bonds, sometimes called T-bills. And what a Treasury bond is, it's when the Treasury, the branch of the government or the department of the government in charge of, buying, raising money and spending it. So sometimes they spend more money than they take in taxes. And what they do is they need to borrow money, and they borrow money using bonds. What a bond is a sheet of paper that they will give you, and it means that I will pay you back a certain amount of money with interest over a certain amount of time. So think, you could get a 1-year bond, and that's the federal government on a piece of paper saying, I will pay you $10,000 in 1 year at 2% interest. So you might go, well, the Federal Reserve or the federal government has never defaulted on its debt. It's always paid its money back on time. So it's a very safe place to put your money. And you can put billions, in some cases, trillions of dollars, people or countries have put into US Treasury bonds. And they're guaranteed to be paid back because the US government has never defaulted in our entire history. So we've done a good job on that. And therefore, people trust us with their money. So a bond is an IOU. Now, you can always sell a bond before it's due. So let's say I buy a bond and 2 months later, I'm like, I want my money now. Well, I can't go to the federal government and say, give me my money now, because the federal government said, we'll pay you back in 1 year. That was what we agreed to. So I'm like, yeah, but I want money now. Well, what I can always do with that piece of paper is sell it to someone else. So if it's a $10,000 bond, I can sell it to this guy for maybe $10,000 plus an extra 100 because there was some interest that I'm not getting. So bonds can be bought and sold on the open market, or they can be bought and sold by the Fed, which is what we're getting to now. So remember, open market operations is when the Fed buys or sells bonds. So let's look at how this works. And I've got a little diagram here. So we've got three people in our economy in this financial bond market. We have the Federal Reserve, okay? And this guy right here is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. His name is Jerome Powell. He's the guy who pretty much makes the big decisions, but he has a lot of advisors and councils and other presidents of districts all around the country, and he meets with them. But this is Jerome Powell. So we're going to just put everything on his shoulders, because when you play the Fed chairman game, you're going to have to take his role and make important decisions that affect the economy. So in the Federal Reserve, they have money and they have bonds. So this is essentially a bond, and you guys can kind of see what it looks like there. And the Fed also has a lot of money. You might say, how much money does the Federal Reserve have? And the answer is the Federal Reserve has as much money as it wants, because the Federal Reserve is what gives your money its value. If you look at the top of any bill that you have, it'll actually say what that bill is, which is a Federal Reserve note. You can look in your pocket right now, right at the top, it says Federal Reserve note, which means if the Fed wants money, it just calls up the Treasury and says, Treasury, go print me $100 billion. Treasury just goes, boom. Fed, here's $1 trillion. They can do it that quickly. They can do as much money as they want. So the Federal Reserve has bonds and they have money. Now, two other organizations we have down here are banks, which also have a lot of money, and they also buy and hold on to bonds. So we have banks and we have households over here, and households who also have money and can buy bonds, as in your parents might have portfolios where they've bought bonds. I know I have some bonds in my portfolio. So these are just three people that we have in our economy that go ahead and will show us how the market works. So let's say that the Federal Reserve was going to buy bonds. This is actually what the Federal Reserve is doing right now, trying to stimulate the economy. So the Federal Reserve was going to buy bonds. They would say, hey, banks and households, I want your bonds. And the banks and household be like, give me a good price. And the Federal Reserve is like, I don't care what the price is. Here's money. So what would happen is the bonds would go to the Federal Reserve. And the money would then end up going to households and to banks. So what you might notice now is that while banks and households don't have as many bonds, they have more money. And here's where it gets interesting. Remember, you can't spend a bond. You can't go to the store and go, here's a $100 bond, I'd like to spend this. They'll say, no, that's not how this works. But you can spend money. So when banks and households have more money, that means there's more money in the economy. And if there's more money in the economy, people have more money to spend, banks will loan more money out, and therefore the money supply will increase, causing more inflation. Think inflation. If I put more money in the money supply, it will inflate it, causing prices to go up. Inflation. Now, the Federal Reserve can do something else as well. So let me go back to kind of where we started. All right. What that means is this. The Federal Reserve can also sell bonds. So if the Federal Reserve sold bonds, what they can then do is say, hey, I've got bonds for sale and I'll offer a price that you'll be happy with. And banks might go, okay, so I get interest on this bond. He's giving me a low price for it. Households and banks might go, okay, I'll take some. So the banks go ahead and will buy some bonds, and they pay the Federal Reserve money. And maybe even households will say, yes, I'd like some bonds as well. And the households give the Federal Reserve money. Now, if you look down here, banks and households, they have less money, but more bonds, which they can turn those bonds in later into money when they mature and the government needs to pay them back. But for now, they have less money. So the banks and the households, which is essentially what our economy consists of, they have less money. And if they have less money, they spend less, and banks have less money to loan out into the economy. So the way to think of this is, since they have less money, the supply of money has decreased, and therefore there'd be less inflation or possibly deflation. So this is how the Fed works by buying and selling bonds. Now you might say, yeah, but the Fed has money and they're going to spend it. And that's where you're mistaken. If you guys remember that big bag of money I pass around the classroom, you might go, the shredded bag, that's the one. Remember, if the Fed has money, that money isn't going anywhere. The Fed doesn't spend it. What the Fed does with money is essentially they keep it, hold on to it, or destroy it. A way to think of it is, if the money's in the Fed, the money is dead. So if the Fed sells bonds, that means the bonds go into the economy, but the money goes to the Fed. And if the money's in the Fed, the money is dead. So that money is not in the economy anymore. Therefore, the economy has less money and less inflation. And on the flip side, the Fed can make as much money as it wants. So it can just say, I want to put money in the economy. So they go, hey, print me some money. They take it and they buy bonds. So they take bonds out of the economy and just start putting cash into it. And then, well, there's more money in the economy. People have more money. Banks have more money to loan out, and therefore inflation. So if you understand that, we can now go back to here. So remember, open market operations is when the Federal Reserve, is when the Fed buys or sells bonds. So in this case, let's start with if the Fed buys bonds. So if the Fed buys bonds, that means that the bonds go where? So think about it. This is where a lot of people get tricky. If I buy something, that good goes to me. So if the Fed buys bonds, the bonds go to the Fed. And if the bonds are going to the Fed, where does the money go? That's right, the money goes to the banks. So if the Fed buys bonds, the money goes to banks. Okay, now banks have a lot of money. And what do banks do with it? Don't you dare say spend it. Banks always loan money out. That's what they do. They take in money and make money off of it. So the money goes to banks. Banks now, that's right, loan this money to consumers or households. So they loan this money to consumers and households. Now households and consumers have, well, money. So if households and consumers have more money, the economy now has more money. And if the economy now has more money, this inside of it, the money supply is increased. This means more inflation. So one thing to remember, if the Fed buys bonds, it'll always, through this path that you do need to know, that means money goes to banks. Banks loan this money to consumers and households or borrowers. This means the economy now has more money, because if I get a loan as a household myself, I'm going to spend that money and buy stuff. And so this means there would be more inflation because more things are getting bought. So that's what happens if the Fed buys bonds. Now, if we look down here, we also need to know what happens if the Fed sells bonds, which is right back to what I showed you before in the diagram. So if the Fed sells bonds, this means that banks are giving the Fed money for bonds. So that means the bonds are going to the banks and the money, and it's always, remember, you got to think where the money goes. So if the Fed sells bonds, the bonds go to the banks, but the money goes to the Fed. And remember, if the money's in the Fed, the money is dead. So banks now have less money, so they give out fewer loans. So if banks have less money, they give out fewer loans. Well, if they're giving out fewer loans, I am not going to get a loan because it would be hard to get, or the interest rate's higher. So if they're giving out less loans, the economy now has less money in it. So if I get less loans, I have less money, I buy fewer things. And if I buy fewer things, stores lower their prices. And this would mean less inflation. So this is how open market operations work. It's where the Fed buys and sells bonds. And if you're wondering, hey, what's the Fed doing right now? Are they buying bonds or are they selling bonds right now? Well, the answer to that should be clear to you. Since we're kind of on the verge of a recession and the economy's hurting, clearly the economy or the Federal Reserve is buying bonds up here. So I hope that helped you guys, and I hope that you understood this. I look forward to talking to you guys soon and answering all your questions. Take care.